Noswaith dda. Mae'n bleser gen i'ch croesawu chi gynnas iawn i'r ddarlith hon gan Andrew Green. Fydd Andrew'n trafod casgliau'r Prifysgol Bangor o waith Sir Kyffin Williams. So good evening and thank you all for attending. I'm Gwenan Hine and I'm the University Secretary here at Bangor University and the Strategic Lead for the University's Arts and Museum Collections and the Archives and the Special Collections. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this lecture, Kyffin in Bangor, to celebrate the remarkable legacy of Sir Kyffin Williams, one of Wales's most celebrated artists. We're delighted to welcome Andrew as our guest lecturer this evening. Andrew studied classics at Cambridge before coming to Wales to train as an academic librarian. He worked in several university libraries before being appointed as the 9th librarian of the National Library of Wales. And during this period, he came to know Kyffin Williams and received Kyffin's large bequest of works into the library. Tonight's lecture coincides with a significant moment for Bangor University as well, as I'm pleased to announce that we have recently achieved museum accreditation, which is a mark of excellence that reflects our commitment to preserving and sharing our art and collections. Among these collections are the paintings by Kyffin Williams. So tonight, Andrew will talk about Kyffin's art, and more specifically, the 11 paintings that we hold in our collection. Following the lecture, Andrew has very kindly indicated that he will be happy to conduct a walking tour of those of you who are interested so that you can view those paintings. So due to the number of people that have come tonight, and we're very grateful to you all, there will be 2 tours. So one will start at 7, one at 7:30. So if you do want to go on a tour, if you could just kindly wait outside this lecture theatre following the lecture. So please extend a very warm welcome to Andrew Green. Diolch a croeso mawr I ti, Andrew.
Wel, diolch yn fawr, Gwenan, am y cyflwyniad gorgaredig yna. Diolch am y gwahoddiad gyda llaw I ddod I Fangor ag am y cyfle I siarad am artist arbennig iawn. Artist sy'n dal I fod yn ganolog I gelf ag wrth gwrs I Gymru. Bron I ganmlynedd erbyn hyn ers iddo fe farw. I must say thank you for the invitation. It's a great honour to come to Bangor. I used to come quite a lot and I don't come very often now, and it's great to be back. It's a particular pleasure to talk about Kyffin Williams. I should say that I'm not a Kyffin Williams expert, and there will be those in the audience who knew Kyffin much better than I did and who know his work better. So I'll get that out of the way straight away. I was at Kyffin's funeral here in Bangor in the cathedral. It was actually on the 11th of September 2006. And during the service, Professor Derek Lloyd-Morgan gave a speech, a very touching speech. And he finished it with these words. I'll quote his words. Sir Kyffin's art is magnificent. So was his humanity. In the galleries that showed his stuff long before his last illness, I often wished that he too, like his paintings, could be an exhibit, so that viewers could peer closely at him and admire not only the obvious grand moustache and greying mane of hair, but also admire the kindest, acutest, blue-grey eyes that interpreted our land and people in such a stunning way, with an artistic distinction unparalleled in our times. Well, I'm sorry to say that we're not going to be able to show you Kyffin in a glass case today, rather like Jeremy Bentham in University College London. But what you will see is pictures of the Bangor University collection of Kyffin's works on the screen, and those of you, as Gwenan said, who wish, will be able to go and see them in the flesh, as it were. Derek was quite right, of course, that Kyffin, once seen, was never forgotten. I didn't know him that well, but I will never forget Kyffin Williams, either the person or the art. He had a very special connection with the National Library, which went back amazingly to the late 1940s and continued until his death. And as Gwennon said, he bequeathed a large collection of not just paintings, but archives as well to the library. He was incredibly generous. And he would come to the building from time to time, especially when there were exhibitions of his work to be seen. And he was a very striking and unusual figure in the flesh. I mean, the National Library has lots of rather unusual visitors, but he was amongst the most unusual. Brown suit, brogues, that moustache and full hair, and that really precise upper-class English accent that he spoke with. I never heard him speak Welsh, I'm sure he could. And all of these things announced themselves with a great flourish. He was very, very fond of telling anecdotes, of course. It wasn't always clear whether they were true or not precisely true. I remember we had one lunch in the President's room in the National Library. There were about 12, 14 people there. Nobody got a word in edgeways. It was just a collection of anecdotes and stories from Kyffin, one after the other. And he was very, very fond of telling certain stories. For example, about how he became an artist, about how he was told by an army officer in 1941, I quote, "As you are in fact abnormal," I think that was a reference to his epilepsy, "as in fact you are abnormal, I think it would be a good idea if you took up art." And another story about how his mother's home help, Gwyneth Griffiths, whom Kyffin described as a beautiful gazelle-like girl, he wouldn't get away with that now, who'd been trained at the Slade, wrote to the authorities in the Slade to say, would they take on Kyffin as a student? And then my favourite anecdote, when he got to the Slade, his professor told him, quite frankly, "Oh, Williams, why do you make your nudes look like oak trees? You can't draw, so you better see if you can paint." Well, it's no wonder really, given all that and more, that Kyffin Williams turned quickly into one of those Welsh people known universally by their forename and not by their family name. And so that's how I'm going to refer to him throughout this talk. I'm going to talk about Kyffin and not Sir Kyffin or indeed anything else. I'm going to talk about Kyffin's art, and I'm going to take as a starting point the 11 paintings which are in Bangor University's collections. Most of the collection was gifted to the university in 1999 by Kyffin, although a lot of them actually have been within the university on loan. Before then, a couple were donated or given to the Normal College, which was a separate institution, of course, then. When we're looking at the paintings, I think it's just well to bear in mind that although painting was the principal medium for Kyffin always, he was equally bold and fluent and prolific in all kinds of other media. I'm thinking of watercolours, drawings, woodcuts, lino cuts, and of course he was an incomparable cartoonist. Most of the paintings, I think, I may be wrong, but I think they're undated. And I'm not going to attempt, therefore, to talk about them in chronological order. All but one of them have as their subjects either Eryri or Ynys Môn, their landscapes. As it happens, all but two, I should say, as it happens, I've spent quite a bit of time recently walking in Eryri in terrible weather, and that experience has actually made me appreciate even more what Kyffin was doing with his Eryri landscapes. Great. I'm going to start though with an exception. It's a painting of a subject which I think most people won't associate with Kyffin at all, and that is this crucifixion. Now, we know something about this painting. The principal of Bangor Normal College commissioned it, we're not sure quite when, to be put into place of worship within the old college, and it was attached to a wall in the library for some time. The crucifixion, the subject of the crucifixion, and the deposition from the cross were themes that Kyffin Williams was interested in the very early years of his painting career, in the late 40s and early 50s. I think as a response to the paintings on those very subjects by the Renaissance masters, because they were the painters that Kyffin was studying intensively when he was learning to be a painter in his apprenticeship. But the Renaissance masters were not the only influences, I think. And if you look at this painting, you will see there are other influences at work, particularly those of 20th century expressionist painters. That's very clear, actually, in some of the other paintings of these subjects. So I'll just show you a couple of them, and we'll come back to this. This is one which is in the National Library, in fact. It's another crucifixion, and a quite different painting of the deposition this time, which is in the Glyn Art Gallery in Swansea. And if you take these sort of together, these three paintings, you can see immediately the influence of expressionist artists. We know that he was interested in Van Gogh, but also in later artists like Oskar Kokoschka and Chaim Soutine. They were all painters who for him were important because their works carried a very, very strong emotional charge to them. I love artists, he said to one interviewer, who would make me cry. You can't imagine a more forthright, simple way of putting it. In this particular painting and some of the others, I think he was very influenced by one particular artist, Georges Rouault, the French artist. For him, crucifixion was a very, very common theme. He produced many, many crucifixion scenes. He'd also been influenced by medieval stained glass painting, and I think you can see a bit of that in Kyffin as well. He actually knew Rouault's works quite well. He'd seen them in the Redfern Gallery in London in 1948. So you can see that the painter developing, but from a number of different influences. This is a Rouault, and you can see a little bit of the influence going on there, and you can see also the stained glass influence as well. Now we're going to come on to the landscapes, and first of all, one called Hills above Nantes Paris, and sorry, I've just got my notes slightly mixed up. It's not because the religious paintings that we know Kyffin for, it's the landscapes. And probably he wanted us to remember the landscapes rather than any other kind of painting. The mountains of Eryri, and particularly, I'd say, Yr have attracted all kinds of artists, of course, ever since the 18th century, from Richard Wilson's time in the 1760s. What was it about the mountains that appealed to Kyffin? Well, one thing was what I call the antiquity or persistence of the mountains, the fact that they're there and they have been there for millennia. In that, they also stand in some way for the persistence of Wales, the Welsh people. which was something of importance to Kyffin. They might even have stood for his own longevity or that of his family, who had lived in Wales, in Anglesey, for many hundreds of years. He himself had grown up, of course, within sight of Yr Wyddfa, and we know that that site, that scene, had fascinated him from a very early age. It may be that painting the mountains of Eryri was also a kind of defensive strategy for him, in the sense that he was fighting against the encroaching modernity, the encroaching Anglicisation of the Wales beyond Eryri. There was another reason too, I think. Kyffin was a very sociable person, but there was a deep strain of melancholy in him. Sometimes that merged into periods of depression. And I think the mountains, in all their stark bareness, may well have reflected a streak of what you might call wintry loneliness in his own spirit. And then finally, I think it's probably a practical reason why Eryri was so important to him. He was, after all, painting to sell. And he knew that the art collectors in Wales, mostly middle-class art collectors in Wales, who wanted to say, we own a Kyffin, wanted this kind of art. They wanted the art that he was producing. The appeal was his ability to express a vision of Wales that was rural, it was elemental, and it was decidedly un-English. And all of those things seem to encapsulate for the collectors their own idealised Wales, Wales as they'd like it to be. I think that's true. And so he was actually painting for a market, and he knew that he would be able to sell and to satisfy the vision that people had. Another mountain painting, Snowdon from Drws. Those of you who know the Nantlle Valley will know that Drws is the very last hamlet that you get to at the top of the valley, the head of the valley. It's quite a bleak place. It was particularly bleak when I went there in June this year, when we couldn't really see very much and it rained constantly. This is also winter, I would guess. The painter who meant a lot to Kyffin, the Welsh painter who meant a lot to Kyffin was Richard Wilson. I mentioned him. And Kyffin was very aware of a painting of much this scene by Richard Wilson. And you'll be familiar with this painting. It's a very famous painting, produced in the 1760s. It's actually called Snowdon from Llyn Nantlle. It's of course a very different picture from the one that Kyffin painted. Kyffin actually called this picture the finest picture of a mountain that has ever been painted, which is a big claim. Apart from the view, the scene, the two, Kyffin's and Richard Wilson's, seem to me to share very, very little. Wilson's picture is really very carefully crafted and framed. It's calm, it's a summery scene, it's got little lakeside figures, and all of these features are derived from the kind of Italianate classical paintings that Wilson was making for all those grand tourists when they came to Italy to complete their education. Kyffin's picture, by contrast, accentuates everything that's wild and rugged and asymmetrical about what is a real landscape. Wyddfa, for him, is dark and glowering against a really troubled steel grey sky. We'll just go back to it. All was a steel grey sky. It's not faded in distance. There's no sunshine, and it looks much more threatening than it does picturesque. Actually, Kyffin painted this scene, that is Wyddfa from the west, from Dyffryn Nantley, on many occasions. And I'll just show you another one. Whoops, going the wrong way. That one is taken from much the same viewpoint as Richard Wilson, in other words, from the western side of Llyn Nantley. But you can see how very, very different the result is. Incidentally, for the first roughly 25 years of his career, Kyffin Williams said he painted in oils in the open air. He was sort of famously impervious to cold or rain or anything else in the elements, but then realized that he could just as well work in the studio and produce the same kind of paintings based on his memories and, of course, sketches. Another painting, very similar in many ways, this is Crib Goch. He painted Crib Goch on many, many occasions. Anybody who's walked across it, I don't know how many people have walked across it, will similarly remember it forever. And he called it a fierce and crinkled ridge. It offered for him a steep rock face and that irregular, rather cruel horizon line, above which he could scatter his fast-running clouds. Crib Goch, he said, is one of my favourite mountains. I like the way it seems to crouch. I like the variety of its shapes, while further up the valley at Penna Pass, I love the way it seems to rear into the sky like a Himalayan peak. In this picture, the clouds are so rain-soaked and so low that the base of them is actually obliterating the peaks of the mountain. Kyffin was very fond of painting winter clouds in rapid movements, conveyed with those broad strokes from the palette knife that sweep obliquely across the canvas, and colours which more or less pass through every possible shade of grey. Kyffin had this to say about the clouds of Eryri. We who live within sight of Snowdon know the clouds that so often hide its upper ridges. They can hang heavily over them, dark grey-black shapes that can terrify those from the plains of England. They can play round the tops, dancing in and out of the cliffs and breasts of the grassy slopes, here 1 minute and gone the next, or they can sulk. A grey, impenetrable mass, eliminating every valley, combe, bulk, or crag. Although I might not like the clouds, I accept them as part of my own landscape, and they form an important part of my artistic work. Here's another different painting of Crib Goch. This one's in Carnarvon. And despite the hint of sun, or there is sun in fact, the mountain crag looked just as terrifying as in the winter depictions of the same scene. Kyffin was really very interested in nature at its very stormiest, and I think if you see that most in the shore and the sea paintings. This one is Storm Triardir from 1996, quite a late painting in the National Library, and you can see how he's relished the sight of the sea in all its stormy excellence. Very, very similar cloud formations in this next painting, Cloud and Hills Above the Trith. I'm not sure which Trith this is. Maybe somebody will tell me. It could be Trith Mawr, I don't know. It's hard to say because this isn't a strict topographical painting, although we should bear in mind, Kyffin Williams said himself that he didn't take liberties with the landscape. He was not a Richard Wilson. This, though, is a simplified, much more abstracted landscape. I think you can see in it the influence this time of rather different painters of the past. Those who followed in the wake of Fauvism and maybe German Expressionism, the painters we call the School of Paris now, in the simplicity of the composition and the colours. And this picture, for me, calls to mind the paintings of one of that School of Paris, Nicolas de Stael. And I'll just show you. Oops, it's not moving. There we are. Now, this, of course, is a much more colourful painting than you would normally associate with Kyffin Williams, but you can see the similarity there, the desire to pare the landscape down to elementary, quite geometrical elements. Incidentally, Leon Evans, one of the critics of Kyffin Williams' paintings, says this about Kyffin's choice of colour and shade. She says, due to an eye condition that made working in bright sunlight uncomfortable, he actually preferred cloudy conditions. This explains why he often adopted a muted palette. That's an interesting thing to think about. To gain the effects in the cloudy sky, of course, go back again. No, can't go back. There we are. Kyffin used a palette knife. I said he used a palette knife from quite an early period, but I think 1946 he first started using a palette knife. He said the palette knife is a great ally in expressing the massive bulk of the mountains and, of course, skies as well. And once he'd found that palette knife aided mountain landscape style, that style, it seems to me, changed really relatively little throughout the rest of his career. Assuming that was Traeth Mawr that we were looking at, I thought I'd just show you another Traeth Mawr painting and how different that same scene could be interpreted by a completely different artist. This is Turner on his trip to Wales in 1798, I think. And you can see how 1799, you can see how very, very different the entire feel of the painting is. It's windy, it's impressionistic, and it's maybe optimistic, a far, far cry from the dark scenes of Kyffin Williams. In the fourth mountain painting, Farmer on the Mountains, Kyffin introduces a human figure. Now, of course, people who worked on the mountains, mainly farmers and shepherds, were always of special importance to Kyffin. In the early 1970s, he said, on Moel Gadair, I often saw the stocky, patriarchal figure of Mr. Owen of Bron y Gadair as he wandered, stick in hand and brindle sheepdog at his heels, to look at his flock, and I am sure to gaze at that lovely world around him. Well, I think he admired these people, the farmers and the shepherds, for their hardiness, for their stability in the landscape, and of course for the care of the animals they looked after. That was important to him too. In a sense, they were as much part of the landscape as were the rocks and the stunted vegetation of the mountains. Although I must say he admired these men, mainly men, at a distance in a way, at a social distance, because of course Kyffin himself came from an Anglican gentry background. It's hard to see him as a shepherd. Now, at first sight, you can actually almost miss the human figure in this painting. So camouflaged are the clothes and the face against the dark tones of the mountainside. I'm going to ask you just to remember this figure, this man, his flat cap and the sloping shoulders and the white collarless shirt, because in a while we're going to see him again. If you're looking for a literary equivalent of this person from roughly the same period, a bit earlier, You might find him, as many critics have noticed, in the figure of Iago Pryfach, the old farmer who appears in many of the early poems of R.S. Thomas. As in a lot of the Erery scenes, there's an air of melancholy that seems to pervade this painting. It's winter again. It's late in the day. The light's fading. The blue-grey sky seems to foretell a cold night ahead. We just wish this glum-looking farmer would hurry down to his cottage and his warm fire. Before we leave this painting, it's just worth noting that Kyffin was very selective in the type of people that he actually admitted to these mountain scenes. There are plenty of farmers and shepherds, of course, but there aren't any hikers, there aren't any tourists, there aren't any national park officials. In other words, Kyffin is constructing a very, very carefully framed world. These people, the hikers and the officials, would really disturb that world. It's a past that's selective. It excludes, if we're talking about the past, most traces, for example, of the slate industry in North Wales, the industry that gave employment and sustained communities right across Eryri for many, many years. When you walk through the landscape today, as I did back in June, it's actually impossible to avoid the quarries when you walk in the countryside. It's impossible to avoid the spoil heaps. It's impossible to avoid the abandoned machinery from the industry. It lies everywhere. And yet these things actually don't feature in Kyffin's work. Here's a slightly similar picture, but this one's set not on the mountains, but in the hill country to the north of the mountains, family Waenvawr. Just a single figure of a farmer near the village of Waenvawr. That's just above Carnarvon, of course. Again, the human figure's almost fused in the landscape, as if it's an immovable part of that landscape, as if this man actually is not going to move anywhere. This picture, by the way, wasn't in the original gift of Kyffin to the university. It was actually bought in 2023 from the North America Wales Foundation. Now, a slightly different painting. This one's called Dyffryn Cesarea. Cesarea was an ex-quarry village, named after its chapel. It's now known as Avron. Kyffin wrote, "The village of Cesarea sprawls above the Nantlle Valley and boasts but one row of houses that could be called a terrace." Incidentally, in one of them lived a woman called Lizzie Jones, who was a poet and who made cups of tea for Kyffin after he'd finished drawing in the fields. Kyffin wrote about this particular landscape, I quote, "Stone walls, cottages, green fields, slate tips. These are what make up the strange, broken land above Carnarvon. It's a hard land. And at one time, the dampness of it brought misery and tuberculosis to the people who lived there. Today, the quarries are closed and only the aggressive tips remind us of the struggles of the last century." He's referring to the 19th century. Well, I walked through Avron back in June in the rain, and also nearby villages, and it is a unique landscape. High sloping country between the coastal strip, of course, and the mountains, crisscrossed by stone walls that enclose rather unpromising looking fields full of stones, low houses, cottages scattered across the land. In this picture, Kyffin is focusing, as he says, on the terrace and a few older buildings. Interestingly, because Avron actually is not like this and hasn't been for some time, he ignores the more recent houses that wouldn't really fit so easily into his vision of the place. For him, the houses have to be seen to be growing out of the land, not imposed on them like later house developers. This vision, I think, is not a particularly comfortable one. It's not a comforting one. The stone walls are all crumbling, the stones litter the fields, and there are no people and there are no animals either. They seem to have kind of abandoned the place. The stone quarries, as Kyffin says, have all gone, leaving the land untenanted. At least you'd guess that from this painting. By the way, today, Avron is very far from untenanted and abandoned, and the old school there has been modernised as a community centre and a cafe and a shop. This is a slightly similar composition, I think, a hillside with sheep, farmer and dog. The village has a bit of a more hopeful air, maybe, than Dyffryn Cesarea. It's not named, the place. I don't know where it is. Maybe one of you will know exactly where it is. I think it may belong to the hills above Carnarvon again, but I think it's more likely to be on Ynys Môn. This time there is a farmer in evidence, and there's a collie dog. That pairing, man and dog, are a really, really basic trope in Kyffin Williams's paintings. And as you probably know, Kyffin made hundreds and hundreds, literally hundreds of sketches of sheepdogs in all kinds of different poses. Here's a picture that's, I think, in the National Library, Farmer Amongst the Rocks. And you can see how interested he is in that equivalence or connection between farmers and dogs. I've always remembered the farmers and their collies, he said. I put them down on my canvases, for they're truly part of the landscape. The men wouldn't have been able to work their hill farms without the help of their dogs, and I've always been fascinated at their relationship. And elsewhere, he said, the relationship between farmers and their dogs is much as if they were joined by a piece of string. Villages, of course, in this part of the world are very rarely kind of nucleated settlements. The houses, the cottages, the chapels, the halls, and so on, they're scattered over a wide area. And I think that suited Kyffin. It suited his artistic purposes when he was composing his paintings and drawings. I think he prized what was accidental, what was crooked, what was rugged, and what was asymmetrical. These qualities he saw as fundamental to the landscapes of North Wales. The beautiful Welsh ponies that must be the most graceful animals in Britain, Kyffin wrote. And ponies and horses, like dogs, they were very, very special entities for Kyffin. I've always loved horses, he wrote. I've sensed their quivering bodies when I've ridden them. I've watched their nervous eyes and their flaring nostrils. Now we come to the only portrait in the university's collection. It may be just one portrait, but it's actually one of the very, very best portraits that Kyffin ever painted, in my view, and not just my view, in other people's views as well. This is the most remarkable picture. We know something about it. It was painted in 1950, and it was bought by Margaret Davies of Grigynnog, one of the famous Davies sisters, for CASO, the Contemporary Art Society of Wales, and they donated it to Bangor Normal College. Sometimes Kyffin is rather overlooked or underrated as a portraitist, it seems to me. But the best of the portraits, for me, rank with the best of the landscapes. They very often have startling compositions, very bold use of paint, even more bold than in the landscapes. And most important, they contain a psychological penetration into the subjects, born, I think, of an empathy, because Kyffin was, after all, drawing, or he could draw, on his own personal difficulties, his own personal traumas, when he was looking at what he saw other people going through. An excellent example, by the way, I'll just show you this. This is a picture of Jack Jones, who was a fellow artist. He lived in Swansea in Havard. A very troubled man indeed. And I think you get an idea from this painting of how Kyffin could actually penetrate through the face and into the very soul of Jack Jones, and reveal some of the difficulties he was going through. I should say that Kyffin took on portrait commissions. I get the feeling he was a little bit reluctant to do so, but he certainly did do so. And when he did that, occasionally, what I talked about empathy and seeing into the character of his sitters, sometimes this didn't quite work. And I'm going just to be naughty now and show you one that doesn't work. He was commissioned to paint a picture of Alan Oldfield Davis, who was controller of BBC Wales. And the two of them clearly did not get on. And this is almost a hostile portrait. Here's another one. This is Thomas Parry. This is in the National Library. Thomas Parry was a librarian of the National Library for a time, as well as being one of Wales's greatest scholars. I'm not sure they got on. I'm sure they didn't get on. My old boss, Brinley Jones, used to say to me he didn't like this painting because it didn't actually reflect the Thomas Parry that he himself knew. He knew him quite well. The friendliness and the warmth of Thomas Parry, he said, is completely absent from this painting. And I think you can see they didn't really get on. This, though, is very, very different. Hugh Thomas was a farmer at a farm called Clytiau Poethion, near Rowen in Dyffryn Conwy. And in the book Portraits, where this is reproduced, Kyffin has written a long paragraph, about the circumstances of the painting, of this picture. And I'm going to read the whole of it to you for a very good reason. So this is what Kyffin says. His wife had just died, and his doctor asked me to paint this portrait as some sort of therapy in order to give him relief from his loneliness and his depression. I found him with a sickle in his hand, trimming a disorderly hedge that appeared to grow out of a broken wall. He was a typical North Wales Celt, tall and spare, with a drooping moustache that accented the melancholy in his face. He was bewildered when I asked if I could paint him. Nevertheless, he agreed, and he accompanied me across the field towards his farm buildings. I painted him in the rickyard. Seated on a stool against the blue of the stable door, the sunlight poured over the hills to streak between barn and stable, picking out his neck and cheekbones, the back of his cap, and the edge of his big moustache. He never spoke. He showed little interest in what I was doing. When the light failed and I had to stop work, a slow smile relieved the sadness of his face as he wandered away with his sickle, once again to go through the familiar motions of trimming his hedge. His daughter wept when she saw what I'd done. Wailing echoed around the old kitchen, and nothing would console her. The critic, Ian Jeffrey, who's written quite a lot about Kyffin, wrote about this portrait and about the writing opposite it. I quote, "Portrait and text complement and enhance each other. Without the text, Hugh Thomas might remain a, quote, typical North Wales Celt. Without the portrait, the painter's memoir would lack the material guarantee of the collar stud and of the cap set at an angle. Now, I mentioned earlier that a figure very, very like this one is in one of the other paintings in the Bangor collection. And what Kyffin has really done is, at last, to abstract the farmer from the context of the mountain and to isolate him in this very plain setting. And that completely transforms how we see the person, completely transforms it. I've quoted Kyffin Williams' words about his pictures quite often in this talk, and that's entirely fitting because Kyffin was much more than a workaday author. He had a gift for storytelling, he had a gift for drawing character, and he knew as much almost about manipulating words as he did about applying paint to a canvas. His memoir, Across the Straits, which was published in 1973, what Lloyd Roderick called an act of written self-portraiture, is, for my money, the best Welsh autobiography written in the 20th century. Now, I just want to finish by returning to the beginning, to the crucifixion. And this painting might look like an outlier in Kyffin Williams's work. Its religious context, or content rather, didn't really find any response in his later paintings. And he actually said, "I cannot describe myself as a Christian in any conventional sense." But it's the suffering, I think, that's in this picture so explicitly. That suffering never ever left him, and he was always interested in it. It underlies a lot of the landscapes and clearly a lot of the portraits, including the one that we've seen. For Kyffin, the mountains were things of beauty, without doubt, but it was a harsh beauty. Living and working among the mountains meant hard, unrelenting labour, which took its toll both on body and on spirit. Stoicism, resignation, dogged labour, they were what mattered, and they are what came across, not energy maybe or joy, when you look at a painting like the portrait of Hugh Thomas and many of the figures of the other farmers in the landscape. Well, I've concentrated today on Kyffin's work rather than his writing, or his character, or indeed his reputation and standing. His continuing popularity, and it's amazing quite how much money his paintings can fetch in auctions at the moment. His continuing popularity and also his rather problematic status as a national institution, a kind of quintessential Welsh artist, I think all those rather interfere with the process of looking at his best paintings and seeing them for what they really tell us about his vision. Bangor University is very lucky to have, to my way of thinking, some superb examples of Kyffin's work. And I only hope you're going to enjoy looking at them in the flesh. Felly, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am wrando, a gobeithio mod I wedi rhoi rhyw fath o gyd-testun I chi o'r lluniau arbennig gan Kyffin Williams sydd yma yng ngasgliad y Brifysgol. A dwi'n gobeithio hefyd bod chi'n cael eich ysbrydoli falle I weld y lluniau o'r newydd. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Gwennon tells me we've got just a few minutes left, but that's enough for any questions or maybe comments or corrections that anybody might have. Don't be shy. I'm sure I've made lots of mistakes. Yes.
Diolch. Thanks very much. One thing that struck me when you were speaking about one of the portraits was that it didn't capture the warmth of the character. I thought warmth is not something that we see often in a Kyffin painting. That struck me. Is that correct? Are there paintings by Kyffin where you think, oh no, there is the warmth of summer in here, or the sun is feeling bright?
I think there is. I think there's definitely warmth in Kyffin. Lots and lots of Kyffin paintings. I think that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of other things going on as well. But I think you're quite right. There is a lot of warmth, and I've used the word empathy. It's overused as a term, isn't it? In the portraits, and indeed in the landscapes where there are figures, I think you can easily detect that fellow feeling is probably a better way of putting it. I think he had a fellow feeling, particularly for certain groups of people, the farmers being one. And I think that does come through very strongly, for me anyway, in those paintings.
I am a little concerned that a few of the paintings have been hit by a football a few times. And I'm just concerned, I hope they are being well looked after, and what's going to happen with those ones that have been hit by the football.
Yes, fortunately, I'm not in a position to comment on football. Really? I don't know whether any of the paintings have been conserved. Clearly, that's something which, over time, will probably need some attention. Any last comment or question?
What I do with this? Just speak. This may be not something you can do, but could you tell me what he actually painted in? I mean, oils I know,
yes,
but what other media did he use? Do you know?
He used watercolour a lot. We don't often see the watercolours, but he used a lot of watercolour, and he was a very, very keen printer. So he would lino cuts, wood cuts, all kinds of cuts. Right. He was very keen on them, and of course drawing. Drawing was second nature to him, and when he was out in the landscape, particularly later on in his career, he would just draw all the time, take those drawings back to the studio, sometimes in preparation for paintings. So he just used everything he could.
Did he ever use mixed media like William Selwyn does?
I think I'm not sure about that. I don't know whether he did. I guess he was more of a purist, to be honest, but I'm open to correction.
Well, thank you.
Well, Andrew, diolch yn fawr iawn. Absolutely fascinating. Can I please ask you to thank Andrew in the usual way? And as I said at the start, if you do want to have a walking tour of our paintings, if you could please stay outside this lecture theatre, and Andrew will take you round. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you all very much for coming.